where we are going to discuss Black people in history, where we've been, what we've been doing. I want to spend some time educating myself and anyone who wants to go on this journey with me into our culture. This week we are discussing 3 reasons why Black History Month doesn't exist in France. Before diving into Before Race Mattered, what archives tell us about early encounters in French colonies. I will be linking both articles as always below. Let's discuss these reasons. Reason number 1, colonies, not mainland. Unlike in the US, the institution of slavery was never legal in mainland France, which makes it easier for France to separate itself from its historical atrocities. The opinion of French actor Omar Sy, who is Black, well reflects the distinction France makes between slavery in the colonies and on a country's mainland. Black Americans, Sy explains, were slaves in a recent past. Their descendants still feel it in their flesh. In France, we have a history with the colonies and immigration. It's heavy, but very different. There's much more guilt in the US. That's an interesting firsthand account. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I need to sit with it for a lot longer, but that is a point. That's pretty much what the UK also likes to fly in the face of the United States, and it's true. It's like, yeah, we did it in the wheel of the machine that was colonization that we all were guilty of, but shit, we never brought that shit home. Number 2, race is not a social construct. For many people, the ideas of Black History Month are incompatible with French republicanism. Republicanism? I think that's better. The French conception of race is very different from that of the United States. Sociologist Michel Wevreka notes that the French political culture does not allow for discussions of race, whereas in the United States, quote, race is, at least for sociology, a social construct. In France, it is difficult to use a skin color, Black in this case, as a source of mobilization. Number 3, one united republic. The French Republican idea holds that there is one France and people should not subdivide into their separate communities, but instead focus on the shared French identity. Like in many other Western European countries, it is illegal for the French census to collect data about racial identity. The idea of keeping racial statistics, I had that right, recalls a dark time in European history of Nazism and Vichy France. I probably said that wrong. It's supposed to probably be like Vicky. Probably both terribly not correct. However, this can make it difficult for minority populations to give voice to their particular struggles when their heritage, besides, quote, French, isn't recognized. Yeah, exactly where my brain was going with that. Like, what? You need to rethink that possibly. So there is more to said article if you want to hear how the writer of said article has concluded what going forward looks like for France in Black History Month. And that article was written by Raina Roberts. So I came across this article that I wanted to share with you by historian Dr. Melanie Lamotte, whose forebears include a slave. She did a brief research article on European notions of during the 17th century when a lot of colonies were being settled by the French. So I am going to see how much of the article that we can get through because I think it's all very intriguing. In the mid-17th century, a French missionary called Pierre Pelprat visited several Caribbean islands before traveling to French Guiana and the South American mainland. Oh my gosh, if you hear me still sound a little bit in my throat, it's because I'm still getting over a cold and I can hear it, so I feel like you guys can hear it, so now I feel like I need to address it. In an infamous account of his travels, he described the blacks of the Caribbean as, quote, so hideous and mishapen that they fill you with horror. Tellingly, however, he did not consider this ugliness to be beyond salvation. Quote, I do not know whether my eyes were charmed, but I usually found the Negroes better shaped and more pleasant after their baptism.
Low tape around his body, it's a fucking homicide. His face is on a t-shirt and his family's traumatized. I didn't even mean to shoot him, he just caught me by surprise. I reloaded my pistol, cocked it back and shot him twice. His body dropped down to the floor and he had teardrops in his eyes.
Pelprat, the Pratt being very relevant, was a generation of Europeans who began to travel widely, crossing oceans to encounter people whose cultures seemed alien and uncivilized. Arriving on the shores of the tropical islands of the Caribbean after a long and perilous sea voyage, Pelprat and his compatriots would have met for the first time, large native populations of Caribs as well as Amerindians and Africans. Many were enslaved to white settlers, making fortunes in commodities such as sugar and tobacco. The missionaries' words make shocking reading, but, says Dr. Melanie Lamotte, faculty of history in Newnham College, it is worth exploring the beliefs that underpin them. Lamotte is a researcher whose work focuses on color prejudice and inter-ethnic antagonism in the early modern French Empire. A French national educated at Sorbonne in Paris and at Cambridge, Lamotte has a personal reason to be interested in the experiences of enslaved people. On her mother's side, she is the descendant of a slave who, in the 18th century, was taken from the coast of Senegal to work on a sugarcane plantation on the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. I used to stay at there's a whole Indiana. Now that I actually know the history a lot more, because I didn't understand why it was called Guadalupe, and they had named all the freaking streets after islands. Oh, it was horrible. It's so horrible and racist, and that's where a whole bunch of black people stayed. What I now see with open eyes.
That's fucked up.
A project to trace her own family ancestry took Lamotte on a often frustrating journey into archival materials. Accounts written by slaves are few. For generations, they were denied the opportunities afforded by education and literacy. She says, quote, I see my work as a form of historical reparation for the inhabitants of France's former colonies whose history has long been neglected or twisted by analysts, and I hope that a better understanding of France's colonial past will shed light on the roots of the social tensions apparent in France today. On the basis of her extensive work on underexplored archival material, Lamotte argues that before the 18th century, quote, race didn't matter in the same way that it came to matter when ideas of racial differences became more fixed. Most famously by laws that prohibited marriages between different groups. Accounts from travelers in the French Empire reveal that although notions of blood and breeding were powerful in French society, for example, in the preservation of the lineages of French nobility, the non-whites encountered by France's empire makers were initially not seen in the same terms. Lamotte has looked in detail at records relating to the French Empire in three contrasting locations. The island of Guadeloupe, it's Guadeloupe, In the Caribbean, I just say Guadalupe because that's also a place I used to work, and we just used to make that play on the name. Al Bourbon, before someone sends me hate mail, in the Indian Ocean, and Louisiana in the former French colonies of North America. In making direct comparisons between these widespread colonies, her research extends existing scholarship to a global scale and also reflects the fact that many travelers sailed throughout the French Empire. Their ideas circulated too, including the notion that non-Europeans could be schooled out of the, quote, backward customs. In arguing that, quote, race doesn't matter or didn't matter, Lamott does not suggest that prejudice did not exist. It most certainly did, but rather it took forms dictated by the preoccupations of a society concerned with behavior, dress, and manners, and of course, religion. During an era in which the outward signs of politis, or is it politis, were paramount, newly encountered people were judged and categorized in terms of level of savagery and barbarism, or at the other end of the scale, civilization. Basically, if you came in looking like Mansa Musa, ain't nobody gonna be talking about, you see that brother over there, you start calling him racial slurs or calling him a savage or a barbarian. Yeah, you ain't saying that to him. You welcome him in the door and you like bowing to his feet because you respect the game. And then he also, I don't think he was Christian, but I think he was, no, because he went to Mecca, right? So no, but my point is, if you was in Mecca, you'd be welcome up in, like, I don't know what Mecca had, like a sultan. I need to look into that a little bit more because I am a little blank on the Muslim religion, despite my sister kind of being a Muslim, but that is a tangent for another day. What I'm trying to say is,
here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money. Money, money, money.
Dollar, dollar.
a good measure of self-interest fueled the initially cordial relations between the colonists, and the inhabitants of land seemed to be rich in possibilities. In some cases, by forging alliances with the local population, the incomers were able to tap into the local trade networks that were vital to securing goods for export, fur from North America and spices from the East Indies. This is actually a very important point that I think is often forgotten on our side, meaning the black side of things. We also just look at colonization as if all the white people came in, they took over, and that was that. There were actual African communities that did prosper and did work cordially for a very long time with these communities or with these colonists as well, because it is better to, sometimes there was a lot more self-interest, particularly on the French side, even though there still were atrocities, in which to, you know, not spend time killing my people and your people when we actually can just, you know, sign a treaty of such. And they were businessmen. Like I was just making a point of, money makes the world go round. And that's exactly what was in both interests if it could be mutually beneficial to the other. So it was in there, at least initially, even if it wasn't something that was kept in play or it was betrayed in the after effect of it. Many of the early French settlers were men, and marriageable women were in short supply. In 1690, only 16 white women were recorded in Isle Bourbon, now La Réunion, an island located in the southwest Indian Ocean. Most European men on Isle Bourbon married non-white women, despite an ordinance issued in 1674 which forbade, quote, Frenchmen to marry negresses and, quote, blacks to marry whites in the colony. In France, Acadia, Canada, the Great Lakes, and the Illinois country, miscegenation, the mixing of groups, was pursued as a deliberate policy to assist integration. In 1603, Samuel de Champlain, French explorer and founder of the Quebec settlement, reportedly assured local communities that, quote, our young men will marry your daughters and we shall be one people. From the outset of French colonization in the Caribbean, the need to maintain a buoyant slave population created a comparably more prejudiced and segregated, quote, plantation society, which is rather interesting because in the United States, to keep the slave population going, not only did they encourage, the sex barns to pop off, or make women, they can have their freedom if they had a certain amount of children that they could pump out to the plantation owner. The masters themselves would go out and have children, have sex with the slaves, because, that's also how to make sure there's an abundance of the population. Father Munyan, a Jesuit missionary who spent time in the French Caribbean in the 1680s, wrote that, quote, some Negroes do not lack intelligence and are capable of all sorts of arts and sciences, should they receive the right education. Thousands of miles across the world, a surgeon named Sieur Delon, who had spent some time in Bourbon 20 years earlier, wrote in a similar vein that, quote, among Malagasys, there are some with common sense, quick-witted, and would be fit for the arts and sciences if they were educated. Some with common sense? You don't think they've been surviving on this whole entire, place for as long as they did with the resources that they did, that you now want to take, that they wouldn't clearly have all the common sense they need for what they're doing? Education in this context involved imposing all-important French rules of politesse, conversion from idolatry to Christianity, and the stamping out of absurd beliefs and ridiculous ceremonies. Non-Europeans were described as sluggish and indolent. Outrage was expressed when some French settlers in North America, rather than Frenchifying the natives, became Indianized themselves. In the early 17th century, a French administrator complained that living among the native people, the French corps de bois, my French is still rusty, woodsmen behaved like the savages and enjoyed an animal life, doing little more than hunting and fishing. The start of the 18th century witnessed a change in attitude on the part of the colonizers. French administrators in North America began to argue against interracial marriages, which would mix good French blood with the bad Native American blood. In 1723, the Colonial Council of Louisiana issued an edict forbidding, quote, all Frenchmen and any other subjects of the king who are white to marry savage women. I think people forget that in the United States, Louisiana was a French colony for like a very long time. The number of mixed marriages dropped, and in 1738, one governor observed that, quote, the Illinois Indians do not invite the French to marry their daughters any longer, and French do not think about this anymore. The French do not think about this anymore. Children of mixed European and indigenous heritage, métis, were by the middle of the 18th century frequently considered to be inferior. French colonists complained that métis children were extremely swarthy and naturally lazy. Dark complexions were seen as indicators of racial inferiority, and the alleged lasciviousness and brutishness that had long attributed to the natives were increasingly believed to be, quote, fixed. Official documents listed colonial populations under headings such as negre or negro, mulatra or mulatto, métis or mixed, and sauvage or I think that's sauvage, indigenous. Ultimately, racial discourses developed partially because the French needed to justify discrimination and segregation towards people who were viewed as a threat to French social, economic, and imperialist ambitions. These people included slaves who could claim emancipation, free peoples of color who presented as economic competitors, and the large Native American population unreceptive to French policies or Frenchification and evangelization. evangelization. Says Lamont. This is interesting as well because you get into a little bit of the, the New Orleans, the Creole period, in which, you had Frenchmen having white wives to go home and have the children to, but then having, or because it was kind of like a compromise because of this particular law, they then decided that once they've done that, they've done their national duty, they can then go and obtain their black wife that they actually truly want and create the second family. And oftentimes they were favored over the supposed white families, which led to that particular time in history where they even stopped that because, they were inheriting the wealth of the white families and then becoming black citizens that are free and now have all this wealth from their white families or white fathers. It's usually white fathers in this case. And that was a threat to, as they're stating, the social economic type of order that they wanted to create, particularly in New Orleans. And so they really ended up at that point banishing all of the Creoles from Louisiana, I believe. Someone definitely fact check me. However, I am going to eventually do one about the Creole period because that is another huge fascinating bit of our own history that is connected to the French history, but it did happen on American soil. So Lamont concludes, people continue to use language and ideas inherited from colonial times, for example, by using the term negres to designate blacks and maintaining the image of blacks as lazy or violent. As a result of centuries of prejudice, many blacks in the Antilles consider themselves inferior to whites. A Creole phrase often heard in Guadeloupe when a baby is born is, they're gonna test my French here, Timon la bien sauté. This means your baby looks good as he or she doesn't have too dark a skin.
There can be only one!
And my, has that still permeated in the black culture to this day. Exposing the ways in which such views she continues took hold over the centuries and telling the tales of those who lived with prejudice is a powerful way of shaping a more equal world. So there is a brief family history for the author if you are interested in getting to know her a little bit better. I thought this was an interesting take, as stated, from a French national from another country, another black woman who is successful, highly educated, and how she is looking for her own ancestry through time and has come to certain conclusions about prejudice always existed. However, it was varying degrees of how that was judged, and the reality of what is preached versus the actions of those in society are always different. And I think that's something we need to recall even now, that just because everyone's on their soapbox about this, that, and the other thing, sometimes you need to take your eyeballs off of social media and what they're telling you and start looking around. Get out and go into the world. Learn about other cultures. Take some of that in, Learn the stories you weren't told and start using that brain of yours to self-analyze and figure out the truth for yourself. There's the stories that they tell you, and then there's the billion stories they don't. If you want to send feedback for this episode of That's What I Call Jones History, you can send that to blackgirlcouch@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment below on this podcast. If you have a topic that you want me to research, definitely put that below as well. My social media will be there. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until the next time, peace, hair grease, and black girl magic.